Hello and welcome to this edition of Africa This Week, your wrap of what happened across the continent. I'm Mashudu Masuta. In this part of the program, we review government leaders' take on investment and job creation in the arts in South Africa, as well as the launch of the Pan-African Network for the continent's think tanks. South Africa's Department of Arts and Culture has developed a new strategy to create sustainable employment and the right environment for arts and other creatives. Minister of Arts and Culture, Paul Mashatile, explained the strategy.
Well, we have decided that arts and culture can play a role in growing the economy and creating jobs. We came with an idea of what we call Mzansi Golden Economy. And basically the idea was that our economies have been driven by primary industries, by mining, but in this period where we are, we think the creative industries, the cultural industries are going to be the major drivers of growth. Hence, we're talking about the golden economy. So we are saying arts and culture, the creative industries are our new gold.
Because traditionally, it's been seen as an underfunded area. And you probably try and get more money from Pravin Gordhan if you could. But it tends to be a soft area, and when the crunch is on, not much money is allocated. Have you got money to do what you want to do?
In fact, interestingly, when I went to Cabinet in 2011, where the Lekgotla, I said, I think this is the way to go. And I had full support from Cabinet, and they said, well, come up with a plan. And hence, we had that summit in 2011. They came up with the concept of the golden economy, Mzansi Golden Economy. And we went back to National Treasury and said, these are some of the things we can do. We're looking at heritage, building new museums through the liberation route. We looked at building an art bank, a whole sort of initiative. And in fact, we're able to get additional funding to do this work.
Now, what are the principles that guide you? Because you will have lots of artists and creative people out there who say, we are a deserving cause, you know, from opera to ballet to traditional art to whatever. What are the principles that guide you in the allocation of your spending?
Well, of course, as you say, the demands are quite high in our sector. What we are saying to people is that show us how you can create jobs. And, you know, from music, to craft, to heritage. Let me just make an example. We are now looking at building new museums and monuments throughout the country. In OR Tambo's village, we will be spending 25 million rands in the first phase of the development.
Well, let's look at that example. And how will you, what will you spend that money on?
Building a monument, an interpretation center, and when you do that, you actually create jobs locally and you stimulate the local economy. Same in KZN with the Dube monument. We're actually creating a craft market there. We've just completed Steve Biko Memorial Center in the Eastern Cape, where we spent about more than 100 million rands. And a lot of jobs are going to be created there. There'll be an internet cafe, there'll be a library, and a hall where people will have all sorts of activities. So what is guiding us now is to say, whether you do heritage or you do a music festival, look at how you can create jobs, even if it's short-term employment.
Now, isn't it in the nature of arts and culture that you're going to get very few permanent jobs, because it can be project-based? In the performing arts, it's a particular production. We think of the Grahamstown Festival, where everyone comes together for 10 days, then it's finished. So there are lots of jobs created, but temporary.
Yeah, but what we do is create cultural precinct so that we have activities throughout the year. So you don't just have one event, is art festival in Grahamstown, and then that's it. You must have events throughout the year. And also there are other spin-offs. Remember, you may create direct jobs with the activity, but there are other spin-offs, because when people go to the art festival, they book hotels, restaurant.
Perception is amongst the most important criteria that investors use when evaluating potential investment. Lionel Skink asked Gauteng's Minister for Economic Development about how her government was attracting the right kind of investment to meet the province's economic vision.
Firstly, we've got to deal with the perceptions that Gauteng or Johannesburg is risky. One of the things, as part of changing those perceptions, as small as it is, we are introducing what you call a hop-on, hop-off bus. Currently, it's the only city where it is available. It is in the city of Cape Town. For the first time, it will be in our shows this Friday just for showcasing it, but we're formally launching it in September, part of the tourism month. And again, we're excited about changing the perceptions that Johannesburg is a dangerous city. From encouraging investors, one of the things we are doing just around here in Sandton, together with the private sector, Ernst & Young in particular, looking at the work that they've been doing, is to establish a one-stop shop or business lounge, which will simply help when business get in there, they'll be able to get information about what to do, where to register and what to do, and to give them information about business opportunities that prevail in South Africa and in Gauteng, because we're hoping to have DTI, SARS, and all of those important stakeholders located there. Of course, at the center of this investment encouragement is to simply say, go to the world to say, this is what our plans are. As the President has spoken about the infrastructure plan that requires about 1.5 trillion rands for us to expand and increase the capacity in our ports, as well as improving our rail, as well as doing and ensuring that our logistics are sorted out. What we need to be clear to the private sector to say to them, where do we want you to play? And under what circumstances, with the triple P, what form and nature, and that information has to be transparent. The third thing that I think as government we've got to do is to help business people to say this land owned by government is zoned for business. Therefore, any business of this nature, industrial or light or financial services, will be welcome into this. And I think we're beginning to that. We're moving slowly, but we're getting there. The SEZ introduction of getting special economic zone of a clustering of sectors so that there can be clear incentives on those sectors located in one geographical location, concentrated there. It's going to help us moving forward. So I do believe that we are gearing towards becoming attractive to businesses all over the world. And I know that a lot of countries in Europe are having a lot of difficulties and will jump at any opportunity when we are being approached by businesses from all over the world to be located in South Africa, because I've spoken to you before that bulk of the things in health, more than 80% of the health procurement that goes to consumables, to medicines, to whatever, and most of those things we import them from overseas. And we can use the African market size to be enticing investors to come here. You look at the computers, we produce very little, if there's anything we're producing around the ICT, from software, if there's little capacity sitting there. So we need to look at the things that the state procures now in mass and be able to entice companies to be located. And I'm glad to say too that in Gauteng we're beginning not only to think about it, but on the point of implementation. So some of the things you'll hear about them on Friday.
Amongst the outcomes of the recent African Development Bank Summit in Tanzania was the launch of a new project that will unpack the issues around global economic governance from an African perspective. Danny Bradlow, coordinator of the new body, explained.
So this is actually a network of think tanks, with the participants and the coordinating unit being the South African Institute for International Affairs and the International Development Law Unit, which I head at the University of Pretoria. And we've formed this network of institutions throughout the continent to look at global economic governance and how it affects Africa, and particularly how it affects South Africa, which is because South Africa is the country that is a member of the G20, of the BRICS, of all the major institutions where global governance is being discussed.
So will the focus only be governance?
It'll be, yes, it'll be economic governance broadly defined. So we'll be looking at what are the issues on the agenda at the G20, what are the issues at the BRICS, how does South Africa represent South Africa in the G20 or the BRICS or either the UN or the World Bank and the IMF. And also, how does it reflect African interests? Because South Africa is a member in its own right as an important country in the world, but because it's the only African country in these mechanisms, it has to advocate for African interests as well. And so that we think there's a role that we can play, because this is not just of interest to governments, it's of interest to civil society, the business community, labor, And so to have a think tank that thinks about these issues and can provide policy relevant information to governments and to other actors in society.
So what I would like to ask you, are there other African countries that are going to be part of this think tank?
At the moment we have about 6 different institutions, some of which are pan-African. So for example, the UN Economic Commission.
But are they from other African countries?
Yes.
The reason I ask you this is because why the focus, I mean, you have said about South Africa having this role in the G20, but
right.
why the focus so much on what's happening in South African governance here when there are these other countries that are involved as well, and we're talking about the African continent?
Because the genesis of this is we've had a project for a number of years in working closely with National Treasury and the South African government, looking at some of the issues around G20 and looking at how to feed in civil society, very broadly defined, so business, labor, civil society views, and to communicate, to facilitate communications between government and these interests. But it's also because South Africa, as I said, is the only African country in these institutions. And as such, it has an obligation to advocate for African interests. And so for us to be able to do that effectively and to understand those interests and be able to convey them effectively, we need a network throughout the continent.
Well, one of the concerns has been, and I'm just going to read it, this is an actual quote, because this was the head of an initiative that had started on funding some of the think tanks on the African continent. And the quote says, most research in Africa is driven by the demands of external donors, leaving little room for innovation. And that's what some of the funders have seen. So how do we change that, just in terms of looking at what Africa needs and researching what Africa needs, not looking at what the external donor needs to find out about the continent?
Right. So that's our goal, is to do research and to promote research that is driven by African interests and needs. And so, for example, we have 2 research projects at the moment that are underway. One is to do a critical assessment of what the G20 is doing and how well that reflects African interests and how well it responds to African interests. And one of the things we'll be doing over the next year is looking at the official communiques and documents of the G20 to see to what extent they reflect African interests, and then doing an analysis and communicating through our network of think tanks to try and get the views of the continent, and then be able to reflect that in this critical assessment. And then we'll do that each year so that we'll be able to see, is it getting better or worse? We'll do it as a general project, and then we're also looking at how well the G20 will deal with food security and with financial sector issues. And then we also have a project on South Africa and the BRICS, which is looking at how well South Africa relates to the other BRIC countries, how they view South Africa, how Africa views South Africa's role in the BRICS. And that's driven by an African agenda. It's not what donors have asked us to do.
After the break, more stories making headlines this week.